All right, so hello everyone. Thank you for joining this online exchange focused on mangrove policy experiences and challenge hosted by the Global Mangrove Alliance. My name is Adriana Vidal. I am the Senior Policy Advisor for Climate Change at the IUCN Climate Change team. And this is the second part of series of webinars that are directed or targeting the Global Mangrove Alliance members, national chapters, partners, etc. So this is the first recording that we're going to do with for all of our colleagues based in Asia and nearby. And so yeah, let's get started with the slides, and then I'll explain a little bit how are we going to run this event. All right. So as you saw in the invitation, we're going to do the following. First, we're going to present the key messages of the policy brief. Sorry, that we have prepared in the last couple of months to respond to some of the questions that Global Mangrove Alliance members have shared with regards to what are the key policy aspects that should be considered or looked into when designing policy enabling conditions supportive of if you can please mute your mics so we don't get disturbed by outside sounds, that would be fantastic. Thank you. So after presenting the key messages, we are going to go right into the case studies presentation, which is the most, I guess, the most interesting part perhaps for many, because we are going to look at examples of what is happening in different parts of the world regarding these policy frameworks and measures that are really supporting mangrove protection, restoration, and sustainable management in different ways. And then, of course, we're going to give as much time as we can for discussion and feedback. Considering that this is an exchange space, we are hoping that any of you, if you want to ask questions or actually share your experiences from wherever you are, please do, and just raise your hand or send a message on the chat, and we'll be happy to hear from you. So that's all from me, and we're going to start right away with the presentation of the key messages of the policy brief. And for that, we have Lydia Slobodian. She has been leading the development of this policy brief, and I'll let her introduce herself and start right away. Thanks, Lydia.
Fantastic. Thanks, Adriana. Hi, everyone. I am Lydia Slobodian. I am the director of the Environmental Law and Policy Program at Georgetown Law, and I teach international environmental law and do research on the intersection of climate change and biodiversity, which mangroves sit at, as we all know. So our goals in developing this policy brief were writ large to support the implementation of international commitments by implementing those international commitments in national level law and policy. And to do that, we are looking at specific national policy and legislative instruments, and also different approaches and options that can be embedded in a variety of instruments. Most importantly, we're drawing on case studies, which we're going to get to in the second part of this webinar, from around the world that illustrate some of these tools, some of these approaches, some of these instruments, and some of these different options, and provide good practices, lessons, some examples that we can all learn from. Let's go to the next slide. The focus of this policy brief, it is not comprehensive. There's a huge range of legal tools and policy tools that can be used to support mangrove conservation, restoration, and sustainable use. We focused on two main approaches and two main types of instruments. The first approach is financial mechanisms, including blue carbon, payments for ecosystem services, and then to some extent looked at various types of fiscal incentives and product certification. Second approach is community management and engagement. So this includes both community management of mangrove resources and community engagement and involvement in projects such as restoration projects. And then we looked at two specific legal and policy tools that can use these approaches or other approaches. The first is national mangrove policies. I'm so sorry, there's an error in the slide. National mangrove policies includes laws and policies at the national level, which specifically focus on mangroves and try to draw together the disparate sectoral approaches that can be used to manage mangroves into one overall overreaching policy. And then the final tool is integrated planning, and this can involve coastal planning frameworks. It can involve cross-sectoral integrated planning measures, and often these various types of plans use environmental impact assessment. So if you go to the next slide. So financial mechanisms that can be used to support mangrove conservation. This is an absolute huge topic, and we were only able to scratch the surface in this policy brief. However, we did get some really brilliant case studies that can shed some really nuanced light on how one does these projects. Blue carbon is a very attractive and growing area, a growing topic for mangrove conservation. However, setting up an effective blue carbon project requires a supportive legal framework and consideration of a lot of different legal elements. First, there are different types of carbon markets, depending on whether there's a voluntary carbon market or a compliance market or a mandatory carbon market. It's important to have some incentive for participation. And in the case of a compliance market or a mandatory market, that takes the form of defined emissions targets. And setting these emissions targets at the right level is really important and somewhat tricky, because if you set it at too high a level, then you can have your market flooded with low value carbon credits, which kind of undermine the whole purpose. That can also be a problem with voluntary carbon markets. Law is also important to set up systems and structures for monitoring and verification to make sure that the projects that are being undertaken actually represent emissions offsets. And then finally, and importantly, for these projects to be successful, there's a need for some consideration of who is going to benefit. So that can be a legal definition of carbon rights, who has the right to the carbon, to sell it and to benefit from it. It can be frameworks for sharing of benefits among a community or among various stakeholders. And it often requires consideration of tenure, including both land and resource, other types of resource tenure. We looked at a few other mechanisms, financial mechanisms, including payments for ecosystem services, various fiscal incentives, and product certification. And we'll hear a little bit more about this. We have case studies from Panama, Costa Rica, and Indonesia that touch on this topic. And if you have other examples from your country, I encourage you to share in the discussion or to pop it into the chat. Go to the next slide. So community management of mangrove resources. We know from decades and decades of conservation that conservation works when communities are involved. However, doing this right requires supportive legal frameworks. In the case of community management of resources, often this takes the form of conservation agreements between the community and government or another entity. These agreements need to specifically recognize what rights and what obligations the communities have with regards to the mangrove resource. You also have some examples of legislation or in some cases, even a constitution, specifically recognizing the rights and responsibilities of a community towards resources, which can include mangrove resources. Beyond setting up the community management framework, again, there's a lot of legal context and considerations that need to be taken into account in ensuring that these community management structures really work. Again, that includes issues of tenure and ownership of the resource or of the property involved. But we also can get into questions of legal pluralism. It's important to note that legal pluralism isn't something that we set out to create. You know, we don't think, oh, I want to set up a mangrove project, legal pluralism. Legal pluralism is often a context of many countries, many jurisdictions in the world where you have multiple legal systems existing side by side. And this can describe cases where you have customary legal systems existing alongside statutory legal systems. It can also describe cases where you have different jurisdictions overlapping. And when these different legal systems are not well harmonized, when they overlap or when they conflict, then you can have problems. And so it needs to be taken into account. And finally, even when we're not talking about community managed mangrove areas, there are still very important considerations, and it can be very useful to a project to partner with communities. And so we have some really good examples in the case studies of partnering with communities in mangrove projects and how you do that well. You can go to the next slide. National mangrove policies and strategies. There's been a big push lately to adopt explicit and specific national mangrove policies. These are national level policies that are specifically focused on mangroves. We always talk about how mangroves are at the intersection of various laws and policies. National mangrove policies try to bring all of that together. Because mangroves are at the intersection of many different sectors, they're often not prioritized by any specific sectoral agency. And so one of the purposes of mangrove policies is to prioritize mangroves, to harmonize and coordinate among and across sectors, and to set targets and define strategies to get all of the actors, both the government actors and the non-government actors, get everyone on the same page. And then there are certain key elements that you see over and over in these national mangrove policies and strategies that can form kind of the building blocks if a policymaker or a consortium is interested in working towards developing a mangrove policy. Background and assessment, principles and values, goals and objectives, strategy and monitoring and evaluation. Okay, to the next. Planning and management frameworks, is particularly coastal planning and integrated planning frameworks, can be a really useful legal tool for addressing mangrove conservation, restoration, and sustainable use. In the case of coastal planning, we have examples of coastal planning frameworks that create special requirements for planning or considerations in mangrove areas, or designate special zones in mangrove areas where, for example, mangrove areas may be subject to higher levels of protection than areas that don't have mangroves. Cross-sectoral integrated planning is trying to do a lot of what these national mangrove policies are trying to do, which is coordinate across sectors and bring all of the actors together and get them on the same page. And these can result in overall management plans, which can set kind of a guide way for those working on mangroves and as well as for other activities in mangrove areas. Environmental impact assessment can be a really important tool for both coastal planning and cross-sectoral integrated planning. Environmental impact assessment laws often create special requirements around mangroves. So that can mean existence of a mangrove in an area triggers an environmental impact assessment, or it triggers a higher level of environmental impact assessment than other areas or other coastal areas might require. There can also be requirements to specially consider mangroves in environmental impact statements. So once an environmental impact assessment is triggered, mangroves need some special attention, and there needs to be a special description of the impact on mangroves. And if you can go to the next slide. So finally, we tried to pull together from the case studies and from the other sources some key considerations to be thinking about in developing these different approaches and these different instruments. The first, and one that we keep coming back to, is the need for coordination and participation. And there's a couple of things going on here. First is public engagement and community engagement, the need to get all of the stakeholders, all of the actors, and also the broader public involved and engaged in the work. The second is community involvement and leadership. This particular community that is affected, involving that community can often be key to the success of the policy, the program, the approach, the project, etc. Here, it's important to think of community involvement not just as community consultation, but as getting beyond that towards community partnership, and most successfully leadership by the community. Cross-sectoral coordination, keep coming back to this with mangroves, the need to bring all of the sectors together and get them on the same page. And finally, this was brought up in the comments on the policy brief. We need to consider gender and the different ways that that gender issues intersect with mangrove conservation and mangrove law. The other considerations include the importance of legal clarity and coherence. Again, if we're working with a range of legal instruments and policy instruments across a range of sectors, it's important that it's clear what the different obligations are on the different actors, including the government, the non-government, the private actors, the community actors, etc. And it's important that we have coherence and not conflict among the different pieces of our mangrove governance regime. Evaluation and alignment of incentives. We have some cases that really highlight the importance of valuing mangrove ecosystems. And that includes not just economic value, though it does include economic value, that is an important part of this, but also non-economic values. And considering that values may be different for different stakeholders. So community may value things in one way, a government agency may value things in another way, and there's a need to consider all of that and to align incentives so that the relevant actors have incentives to work towards our common goals. Efficiency and effectiveness. It's not enough to just put the frameworks in place. It's not enough to just adopt a nice, beautiful policy. There needs to be some consideration towards its implementation and whether it's going to be effective. And part of that is considering its efficiency. Is this an efficient way to solve the problem? Data and monitoring. Again, in the case studies, we have some really good examples of use of data and consistent monitoring. There's establishing a baseline and then monitoring consistently the health of the mangrove ecosystem in relation to that baseline. How important that can be for not just conservation and restoration activities, but for informing and influencing policy. And then I want to open it to the group and see what other suggestions that you have based on your experiences, based on your jurisdictions. What else are the key considerations that we should be thinking about?
Thank you, Lydia. While people warm up, perhaps to raise their hands or post a question on the chat box, let me ask you this. So, as you mentioned at the beginning, there is more and more attention given to mangroves, its importance, and what are the best solutions to ensure that mangroves are protected, restored, etc. And from the lens of policy and legal measures, there is no, I mean, I understand that there is no one formula for all countries, and every country will have its own reality and context to follow. There is no question about that, but what would you say has been the most recurrent instrument that you've seen in these case studies or other case studies that you have researched on, the most recurrent approach, I guess, to design policies or measures that really set this mangrove agenda towards positive results. Yeah, so if you can share those ideas, that would be great.
Yeah. I think in my experience and also in my review of case studies from around the world, the single biggest factor is community engagement. And again, not just engagement, but ensuring that mangrove projects are led, or at least led in partnership, co-led by local communities. I find where local communities are leading the way and are in a position to have a real voice in how the project is carried out, how policies are implemented, et cetera, that's when you get success.
And second question before we move to the case studies. Yeah, you made a good point about the frequency nowadays about of mangrove law, like new mangrove laws, national mangrove laws. Are these the best thing that has come up lately to address the issues around mangroves from all perspectives, or even within that scenario, there are some considerations to pay attention to?
Yeah, so there's an interesting question when dealing with mangrove laws, whether you need the word mangrove in the law. So increasingly, we've seen specific attention to mangroves. We've seen mangrove laws that are specifically geared at mangroves. There's also a huge range of law that covers mangroves, but might not be specifically geared at it. And when I started looking into this, I did not see why we would need a specific mangrove law. You know, if we have a forest law that covers mangroves, like why do we need to put the word mangrove in there? And working through this project and the various projects I've been involved with, I've come around to this idea that having the word mangrove, having that explicit focus on mangroves, whether that's in an environmental impact assessment law, or whether you have some kind of national overarching policy that clarifies that, that can be really important, because otherwise your mangroves are going to fall through the cracks. Even if the forestry law technically might apply to mangroves, or your coastal planning law technically might apply to mangroves, it's not going to be at the forefront of anyone's mind when they're implementing that law as a regulator or even as a regulated entity.
All right. Yep, that's a good point. Thank you. Nadia, I see your hand raised. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Adriana. Great presentation, Lydia. I completely agree with you. For Belize, although we have the National Forest Act, we also have a national mangrove regulations, and we find this to be very useful because when we look in across the years, the country has prioritized the upland forests and not so much mangroves. So having an actual regulations that focus on mangroves have been very helpful. And we had, you know, in 2018 that regulation was updated, and we were brought in as World Wildlife Fund to be a part of the task force that the government put together to update that regulation. And so we feel very close to the process because we were able to not only improve fines for infractions for permitting, but we were able to also flag areas that are low-hanging based on the ecological importance of these mangroves within regulation as well, so that they can be considered for future protection, or that they can be a part of a stronger screening when it comes to review of development projects along the coast where these ecologically sensitive areas are. And so having that is certainly important. But even going beyond the national policies and regulations, I think that we also need to come up with voluntary options as well, where we can engage not only local communities, because of course it's very important to engage local communities because they are facing the brunt of impacts because they depend on these ecosystems for livelihoods and for coastal protection. And we see now that it's very important for us to engage the private sector, the landowners that want to develop these lands into hotels and resorts, the realtors that are selling these lands, and selling dreams to developers. And so we are working on trying to make sure that we create engagement strategies to effectively engage these new sectors, that we normally don't engage. Sharing with them greener options for development, for example, ideas of how can they develop in a way that their development fits within the mangrove landscape rather than significantly alter the mangrove landscape for their development. Some would just go in and clear cut and just construct, for example, and put up a concrete seawall, for example. So showing them the different options and also showing them results from valuation of green versus gray or the mixed green-gray kind of ideas. So it's engaging them, educating them, bringing them into the whole engagement when it comes to promoting or increasing ambition for protecting these ecosystems.
Yeah. Nadia, I think that's a really good point. I'm a lawyer, so I see everything through the lens of law. And I think that even when we're talking about voluntary engagement with companies or with communities, we still need supportive legal frameworks for that. Like if we're talking to landowners, we need clear tenure. We need to know who is owning this land and what rights they have to the land. When working with companies, transparency is really key to be able to see, if you're watching a company, if you can see what they're doing, even just having that level of transparency can really help motivate them to shift their behavior.
Sure.
Working with private landowners or communities, voluntary conservation agreements, these are just contracts. They're legally enforceable as contracts, but putting that kind of agreement, that legal agreement in place can help clarify everyone's obligations and responsibilities and really give support to voluntary actions.
Oh, I fully agree, Lydia. And in that case, and when we get into the Belize case study, we'll talk about what we have ongoing in terms of land tenureship analysis as well. And when we come up with these ideas for green options, we also share that with the government, the Department of Environment that issues environmental clearance for development, looking at sharing those with EIA preparers so that they consider these when they make recommendations for these kind of development to landowners, for example. So it's trying to take a more integrative approach that uses the legal systems and building up other thinking outside the box of trying to bring other ideas to the table as well, to increase championship for protection.
Yeah. Yes. Fabulous. Thank you so much, Nadia, for bringing attention to these practical considerations that can definitely be supported by policy measures, requirements, and these rules, for instance, that we look forward to hearing in your presentation. So just to share a couple of quick questions and ideas before we move into the case studies, what I see on the chat. The first question I see is that whether within national mangrove strategies, so strategies are policy instruments, right? They don't have necessarily mandatory obligations or enforcement considerations. This is more like a policy instrument as such. So when those exist, national mangrove strategies, the question is, do these include, or I presume refer to specific laws and regulations to protect mangroves, or it is more often that they pull from existing sectoral laws and regulations? So yeah, basically it could be an option, right? Instead of creating a new mangrove law, a country can have a strategy, which is a policy instrument, that refers to different existing sectoral, I guess, sectoral regulations. And is that as effective as having a national mangrove law, perhaps? What are your quick thoughts, Lydia, on this?
So I think it really is important to. So first, when we're talking about the national mangrove strategies and policies, to be clear, in this case, in this context, we are talking about mangrove explicit national policies, as Adriana said. And then I do think it's important that those policies refer to existing sectoral laws and regulations, because these agencies that are mandated by those sectoral laws, they are going to be working in the mangrove space. So we need to bring them all on board. So we need to at least clarify how the existing sectoral laws and regulations apply in the case of mangroves. And then, yes, sometimes they do also refer to mangrove explicit laws and regulations. Occasionally, part of the national mangrove policy will be an impetus to try to develop a new legally binding mangrove explicit regulation, but often there might not be those like national mangrove laws, those legally binding laws, and so they're really drawing on the existing sectoral laws. And I don't see that as a weakness. I think that's really important, and I think it's really a strength.
Okay, thank you. Lydia, I'm going to ask you to please address some of the questions on the chat by answering to the chat while we move on to the case studies. And just to say that, well, Dominic just left a comment, which is important to highlight, which is that these national policies on mangroves shouldn't focus on, let's say, tree planting or hectare goals purely, but it should be more strategic in the sense of if they are setting up goals, these goals are thinking of the potential risks of promoting tree mangrove planting versus conserving what exists. And then, well, he actually, in a comment, he puts a lot of good content there. So I invite everyone to read elements about coordination, training, which is, of course, capacity building, technology transfer, etc., that we should all consider when working on the policy field and implementation. But now I would like to move on to the case studies, because moving from theory to practice, what is happening across the world, I think that's will be very interesting to hear. The first case study that we have is from Indonesia. And I will leave Apri to take us through the experience in Indonesia. Please, Apri, introduce yourself very quickly and go ahead with your presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Adriana. Good morning, everyone from Indonesia. I will present a case study, which is we will present the biorights mechanism that we've implemented in the Building with Nature program in Demak, Central Java province in Indonesia. So I will start with what's the Building with Nature and what is the biorights mechanism. Building with Nature is an approach that integrates ecosystem restoration into water and marine engineering practice. The main concept of Building with Nature in Indonesia is to create a mangrove-based economy through Building with Nature, because we believe if we have a prosperous local economy, it will enable maintenance of mangrove greenbelt. And in return, mangrove greenbelt will provide coastal safety, will enabling economy to prosper. The flagship of our activity of this program is a combination of smart engineering techniques and ecological rehabilitation, as well as introduction of sustainable land use practice. We use this approach in our Building with Nature program, which implemented in coastal area of the Central Java from 2015 until 2021. We work in 9 coastal villages with 11 community groups, totaling with members around 250. The implementation of Building with Nature program in the field is through biorights mechanism, a funding mechanism where the program will provide loan funds for community groups. Sorry, Adriana, next slide, please. Yeah. The implementation of Building with Nature Indonesia program in the field is through biorights mechanism. So it is a funding mechanism that the program provide a loan for community groups to carry out the activities. And when the group is successful in its implementation and reach the target of success indicator, then the loan funds we will turn into grants. The bioRES mechanism itself is designed to implement all the technical measures of mangrove rehabilitation, also the aquaculture revitalization, because the main livelihood of community surrounding the area is aquaculture, and livelihood diversification to accommodate other livelihood in the area, and also policy dialogue that conduct by community group in village level until the district level, and also the capacity building of the community groups. These points, these activities, it's contained in bioRES agreement package, like you see in the middle of a slide, where the program will provide the funding, the knowledge, and the assistance from the expertise, and community will provide land or ponds or area for the activities, labor, and working time. In field implementation, community groups are the main actors. They are the implementers. But we, as a program, will provide assistance, monitoring, evaluation, and monitoring and evaluation of the implementation. Next slide, please, Adriana. So during the implementation of building with nature, we also get the support from government, from the national level, provincial level, district level, until the village level. They support our program. Form of the support, they provides some program allocation and also funding to the community group directly, and but they cannot provide comprehensive support. They only can support in some elements of the program, and government also only able to implement a bioRES approach with cooperation with other parties. In this case, it means with us, with as a NGO, and government could adopt the building with nature bioRES elements that serve its development targets and fits into the planning and budgeting process. So they government only can take some part or some element of the mechanism, because it's need to align with their target, with the mechanism in the government process. So in consideration, if we want to scale up this mechanism in Indonesia, maybe will adopt by another parties or government, we have some factors that need to take into consideration if we want to scale up this, like how to prepare, make the preparation and planning, how to build the trust building between community with the program, and then we also need to have a strong local ownership from the community. We also need to develop fair and clear bioRES contracts. And then for sure we need to also engage in policy advocacy in the program. Also engagement with village government. We also should provide a strong capacity building program, and then we involve the community for the participatory monitoring, and we also under our program, we have the flexibility to adjust make some adjustment in the field, and we also have a field facilitator which support the community group to implement the program, and also at least the last but not least, adequate funding and time. And during our implementation of bioRES mechanism in this project, in this program, actually there is interested from government is interested to adopt this concept, but we have some challenge. The government have some challenge. The first one is government funding, government program funding is usually only for 1 year period, 1 year cycle. So it's we need to find a mechanism how to align, because on biorights mechanism, 1 year is not enough. At least 3 or 5 years, because we have a long process. Second one is there is no, government don't have a debt system in the government program. So this is something that we also need to find the way how to adopt this mechanism in the government program. And third one is the government doesn't have sufficient resource to provide incentive assistance. So this is like we need facilitators, we need assistants to stay along with the community during the program. So this kind of is also a problem in government. So we need to find this challenge in the field. So based on our discussion, based on our experience and our learning from our implementation, there is opportunities in Indonesia, which now we have environmental fund management agency or Badan Pengelolaan Dana Lingkungan Hidup. So I think this is more flexible to manage the funding for support support activities conducted by community. This agency is supported by government regulation and also presidential regulation. So this is one opportunities and also entry point for us in Indonesia to promote this mechanism as one option how to manage funding to support restoration activities in by community in Indonesia. Okay, I think that's all, Adriana. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Apri. I just sent I sent a question to you on the chat. Aware of the time, instead of asking you to answer with orally, if you can just type the question on the chat so everybody can read it, that would be fantastic. Thank you so much. And others, please write up your questions as well for Apri on the chat, and I'm sure that he'll be answering to those questions. So moving on to the next case study, it's from Costa Rica, and the person presenting this is Jill Hamilton from CI. Jill, please go ahead.
Sure, thank you, Adriana, and hi everyone. Really a pleasure to be here with you all today. I am sharing this case study on behalf of both the CI Costa Rica team and several other partners, including Pew Charitable Trusts, who have been working with Costa Rica to enhance blue carbon policies and conservation and restoration in the country. So today, my case study that I'm presenting will focus on Costa Rica's national blue carbon strategy. This is a fundamental tool that Costa Rica developed to achieve its NDC and national decarbonization plan targets. It is also important to recognize that it builds off several existing policies that Costa Rica already had to protect, restore, and conserve its coastal ecosystems. And the key element of this national blue carbon strategy, which this approach could be replicated in many other countries, is that it helps existing policies and existing efforts to be aligned and streamlined into one comprehensive national framework. So the Costa Rica National Blue Carbon Strategy bridges across 23 different policy instruments in Costa Rica to align national mechanisms, institutional mandates, and international commitments such as NDCs under the UN Climate Agreement. It also provides a legal and institutional framework for integrating these ecosystems into sustainable management, and looks at strategies for efficient, transparent, and sustainable financing mechanisms, which include both blue carbon credits, so market-based mechanisms, as well as other non-market-based approaches to financing conservation and restoration of these coastal habitats. There's also a focus in this document on fair and inclusive benefit sharing that promotes local capacities and is really targeted at enhancing and strengthening community well-being. So some of the key takeaways of this document when thinking about replication elsewhere is that Costa Rica is not special necessarily in being the first to develop this document, or in the way that it is unique in being a good fit for such a strategy. However, there are some legal structures in place in Costa Rica that have really helped this work progress, and I think that's important to recognize. One of these components is that mangroves and blue carbon ecosystems are a public good. So it's a government responsibility in Costa Rica to manage these areas. Therefore, it is slightly easier, perhaps, to develop this strategy than if more complicated carbon and land tenure systems exist. That is why it's so crucial that this be a participatory process, this type of policy development, whether in Costa Rica or elsewhere. And then as a final point, Costa Rica is currently looking forward in how to make this national blue carbon strategy actionable. So they're working on the development of an action plan in the coming years, and working collaboratively with government sectors, agencies, and other stakeholders to really implement these plans. And then also looking into how their progress made in mangrove ecosystems could be replicated and expanded into seagrasses and other blue carbon ecosystems. So that's all from me, and happy to connect you with our Costa Rica team if you have any questions. Thank you.
Apologies, I thought you had a second slide, that's why I quickly moved. I thought.
Oh no, but I am done, so all good.
Fabulous.
Thank you.
Well, a couple of people are asking for the link to the strategies, not from Peru, it's Costa Rica, by the way.
I'll put the link. We have it in Spanish and English, so I'll put that in the chat. Thanks.
Fabulous. Thank you, and very, very interesting. And if you have any other source that perhaps analyzes or comments on the strategy, please do share. And of course, needless to say, this information will also be part of the brief. All right, so now moving on to the next case study. This time we're going to Belize. And Nadia, please go ahead with your presentation. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Adriana. It's a pleasure to make this presentation on behalf of the WWF and Pew. In late 2019, World Wildlife Fund and Pew formed a collaborative partnership to advance or to increase ambition for protection of coastal wetlands in Belize. And the approach we took is quite integrative in the sense that we use science and research, we use stakeholder and community engagements, and we look for opportunities to influence national actions, helping to contribute to Belize's national and international commitment around biodiversity protection and climate. One key policy instrument that we have worked to influence in Belize is the updating, contributing to the updating of Belize's 2021 nationally determined contribution to the UNFCCC. Our aim is to ensure that we are able to increase targets, time-bound quantitative targets for coastal wetlands, including mangroves, of course. So on this screen, we are showing here some of the targets that we included within Belize's nationally determined contribution. We were able to work with the government of Belize and the NDC partnership through its technical working group to make sure that we help Belize in setting these time-bound quantitative targets within its NDC. Specifically, as it relates to mangroves, we aim at trying to double the protection for mangrove areas under protection, I should say, that was existing prior to the NDC update. And that included trying to protect at least 12,000 hectares of mangroves by 2030 in a phased approach, 50% by 2025 and an additional 50% by 2030. In addition to trying to protect mangroves, we also work with the government and the NDC partnership to set targets for mangrove restoration, with a target of at least 4,000 hectares of mangroves to be restored along vulnerable coastlines within Belize. We also set a target to work with the government and other partners to halt the net loss of mangroves within the country. And of course, this is very challenging because we know that there's a demand for development. People own lands and they want to develop their lands. So trying to find that balance where there could be reduced loss of the ecosystem is challenging, but we are trying to make some inroads anyhow. But the important thing is that we got the government to commit to it within its NDC. We also set a target to carry out an assessment of the carbon value of Belize's mangrove ecosystems. And this here, it mentions below ground because at the time they were just doing some above ground analysis at some localized sites. So we set out to do a more national level accounting of mangroves carbon stock within Belize's mangroves from both an above and below ground perspective. And then using that information to work with the government to integrate within its REDD+ inventory. And most of the targets that we have included within the NDC are conditional, which means that we can, the country agree to do it, provided that they have the technical resources and they have the financing that is needed to meet these targets. And so we also included here the exploration of financing options to support the implementation of these targets on the ground. And then working, to increase community stewardship of coastal wetlands within the country. So based on these targets, we have made some, we have had some achievements, some good inroads, because in addition to the working with the government to update its NDC, we also work with the government to create an NDC implementation plan and a tracking framework to track how Belize is progressing in terms of meeting these targets. So we work with the government to develop such an NDC implementation plan. And then we also have achieved the assessment of the mangrove carbon stock. So we had the target, and we have in 2022 we were successfully able to carry out the national carbon stock analysis within Belize's mangrove landscape. We did this in a very inclusive and participative manner with the government and local NGOs as well. So we now have an idea, for the first time, Belize has an idea of what its potential carbon stock is for its mangroves, and it's estimated around 25 teragrams, which is equivalent to about 13 million rather cars, pretty much in terms of 30 million cars buried. In addition to doing the carbon stock analysis, we have successfully also worked with integrating that findings from the analysis within Belize's REDD+ inventory. So we are very proud of this because Belize can then report on this to UNFCCC and other international agreements that they have signed on to. We are also in the process of doing a national mangrove land tenure analysis. As I mentioned before, a lot of Belize's coastal areas are in private hands, and so it begs the need for us to work with the private sector as well on greener practices. In addition to working with government to make sure that its national mangrove regulation is effectively implemented, effectively socialized. And so what we've started to do now is working with the government through its Coastal Zone Management Authority and Institute and its national Lands and Surveys Department to do this land tenure analysis. As part of this process, we are also developing an engagement plan for landowners to better engage them on mangrove, whether it be for them to conserve mangroves on their property or help to restore mangroves on their property, and in terms of better design, in terms of their development, the landscape development. We are also in the process of developing a national mangrove restoration plan, and this mangrove restoration plan will help us to better identify locations where we can target development, target the actual restoration of mangroves within countries based on the target that we set within the NDC. Next slide. So this slide does speak a little bit about the mangrove restoration plan, its purpose, and where we are, and the process within which we'll be, we are working to develop this plan. Of course, the plan aims to promote mangrove restoration across Belize, but before we can actually, do that, we need to understand, where, within the country we can carry out these restoration activities. And so then we have started efforts in July where we've met with the government, different government departments, some of them that permits development or have the mandate for issuing land mangrove clearance, or issuing mining and dredging, issuing land creation, issuing mangrove clearance, for example. So we've been working with them, and we just completed local mangrove workshops where we engaged a total of 16 communities, coastal communities across Belize from north to south, to get from the communities information on what they would like to see done in terms of a national mangrove restoration plan, understand from them what are the key threats and drivers of mangroves loss within their community, what are the key challenges and opportunities for mangrove restoration, so that we can then take that information and putting it into our modeling and spatial analysis to help hone in on identifying some of the locations that can be targeted for restoration. The process is very inclusive, very open and transparent. So we want to make sure that community voices are strongly integrated within this plan, and we want to ensure that communities help to deliver on this plan on the ground once it's completed as well. So it's not going to be just a national plan that sits on a shelf, but it will be used to engage communities and the private sector and the government to make sure that we make meaningful strides in terms of mangrove restoration throughout the country. And the plan also will be guided by a monitoring and evaluation plan, so we can track how we are progressing in terms of that. The plan, of course, as I mentioned before, we started in 2023, and we expect that we could have this plan completed by mid-2024. It will be including input from the local level. It will include baseline assessment, field verification, vulnerability assessments as well. So it's going to be a very iterative process, and so that's why it's taking a bit long to get it completed. And also to make sure that we are able to have the government, adapt this plan, is that it will be signed off by the government cabinet as well. And it's been guided by a committee that we put together that includes relevant government departments that are listed on the slide. So that's it for
Thank you so much, Nadia. It's interesting to see that it started with the NDC targets, conditional targets, but that it's trickling down to a specific national restoration plan. And I actually have a couple of questions that I'll be posting on the chat for you. And I know that we almost ran out of time, but I do want to give space for the case study from Seychelles. Sorry for the mispronunciation. So please, over to Annalise, and I'm sorry to give you the least amount of time, but you can summarize quickly these key messages. That would be fantastic. Thank you.
No problem. Hi, everyone. My name is Annalise Zimmer, and I work for the Pew Charitable Trusts. Thank you all so much for having us here. It's been a pleasure to contribute to this policy briefing book. And I'm going to turn my camera off just to preserve my bandwidth. So I'm happy to share about Seychelles in the context of their NDC targets, and then how that has led to, or NDC targets are supporting existing legislation in Seychelles. And I know you're all looking at this photo of seagrass thinking, this is a mangrove event. Why did she put a picture of seagrass? So I want to just provide some context there. That Pew's support in partnership with Seychelles
in particularly the Seychelles Conservation and Climate Adaptation Trust, which are our partners on the ground in Seychelles and contributed significantly to this case study. Our work in Seychelles has been mostly related to seagrass. However, there are so many learnings that we can share between ecosystems, and Seychelles also has some really bold, ambitious commitments to protecting their mangrove ecosystems. So I will be sharing about both mangrove and seagrass, and hopefully those learnings are transferable. So I'll start with the NDC targets from Seychelles' most recent NDC, current NDC, and these are all within the adaptation section of their NDC. These include fully mapping the extent of mangrove and seagrass ecosystems and conducting carbon assessments of those blue carbon stocks. It also includes ensuring that at least 50% of the nation's mangrove and seagrass ecosystems are protected by 2025 and 100% are protected by 2030. And for some context, there's about 2,900 hectares of mangroves in Seychelles. That's about 6% of the country's landmass. Another NDC target is to establish a long-term monitoring program for seagrass and mangrove ecosystems, and including those field verified carbon stock assessments into the country's greenhouse gas inventory by 2025. You can please go to the next slide. Thank you. So some updates on the status of Seychelles' current NDC implementation. The first ever field verified map of the country's seagrass with accompanying carbon stock assessments was completed. And the data from this research was shared with the government to integrate into their greenhouse gas inventory. Similarly, the first mangrove blue carbon assessment was completed by the Ministry of the Environment, Energy, and Climate Change, and this data is also being integrated into the greenhouse gas inventory. Something I really love about the Seychelles case study is the way in which SECAT and government included local communities in this process. So in Seychellois Creole, there was not a word specifically for seagrass or for the different species of seagrass. So there was a grassroots campaign led by SECAT to add relevant and culturally appropriate words for seagrasses to the Seychellois Creole dictionary. And I just think that's a wonderful story of including communities and culture, which can be transferred to many different coastal ecosystems, not just seagrass. You know, we want to protect the things that we care about, the things that we have the language to speak about. So I think that's really powerful. And finally, there are several different relevant national policies and institutional movements that allow Seychelles to implement these ambitious targets to protect and map and manage their mangrove and seagrass ecosystems. First off, I want to just share that the NDC was adopted by Cabinet prior to the submission to the United Nations. Therefore, the NDC operates in Seychelles as a policy. It's implemented by the Climate Change Department of the Ministry of Agriculture, Climate Change, and the Environment, and is further managed and implemented through a few different national policies and plans, including the National Climate Change Policy and Strategy, the National Development Strategy, and the Seychelles Marine Spatial Plan. Also want to add as a final note, in very similar context to what other case studies have shared this evening, land tenure remains very important, especially in the case of Seychelles, and there's ongoing discussion about how the implementation of the mangrove protection targets will be implemented, and this depends on the current protection status of mangroves in various locations within the country. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Annelise. Yes, I think that there is much more to say about this case study, because there are a lot of things that are under development. And it's good to hear that there is already a policy framework in place that enables the implementation of the NDC targets, particularly the adoption by the cabinet, and then the other instruments. But then the how and to implement the targets in terms of protection, restoration, etc. And that will be very interesting to see and keep an eye on. Well, I'm sorry to say that we have reached the end of the webinar, and obviously the time allocated is never enough. But I want to thank you all for joining, and from the several places in the world that you're located in. We are all a community of mangroves across the world, so we are always in touch. Please, if you want to follow up with any of the presenters, we are just an email away. I'll make sure that we share the contact information tomorrow. And we will share all of the materials naturally very shortly. So again, thank you so much to the presenters, to the GMA partners for joining, and to the participants as well. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Adriana. Thanks, Lydia.